You think Paris is the city of love? Well, you do. But only if you don't sleep under a bridge in the middle of winter with just a plastic bag and 3 pieces of cardboard. Welcome to the other side of France, where the Eiffel Tower shines brightly, but thousands of people sleep on the metro right under your feet. And no, this is not a small thing. Since 2012, the number of homeless people has almost doubled. It is now over 350,000, 3 times the population of Monaco. Paris is no longer just about croissants and cafes, but also a series of hotels without walls in the heart of the city. And you won't believe who lives there. Number 1. The crisis that built in silence. In 2012, there were around 143,000 homeless people in France. By 2024, that number will reach 350,000. That means that every year on average, more than 17,000 more people will fall off the safety net off their address into invisibility. Not only is that double the population of a medium-sized city, but it is also a clear sign that something is collapsing not from the sky, but from the ground where these people are forced to sleep every night. Not everyone living on the streets is homeless. About 185,000 people are living in subsidized shelters. Another 100,000 live in crowded migrant reception centers. A small fraction, about 16,000, live in makeshift shanty towns, rows of tents, old shipping containers, or converted trucks parked outside urban areas. They all have something in common. They don't have a legal address, which means they can't get mail, can't register for formal employment, can't rent a house, or even get a bank card. France has a welfare system that is considered one of the most robust in Europe. But figures from the Abbé Pierre Foundation for 2024 show that another 1 million people are living in severely degraded housing or living in cramped conditions for generations, a form of sheltered homelessness. That raises the question not on paper, but on the sidewalk. What makes a wealthy country allow hundreds of thousands of people to be pushed to the margins? Around 54% of the homeless in France are women. During the winter, demand for night shelters for this group skyrockets, but the number of beds available is not enough. As for children, the latest statistics show that more than 31,000 under 18 are living without a stable place to live. This is no longer a humanitarian crisis. It is an erosion of the basic function of the state to ensure that citizens have a place to live at least within the minimum boundaries of dignity. The concept of homelessness in France has gone far beyond the traditional image of vagrants. It includes commuters who sleep in their cars, students who can't afford to rent, elderly people living in shabby motels because they're not accepted into nursing homes. This segment is called mal logés, people living in inadequate housing conditions, and it's growing like a silent cancer creeping into the middle class. The image of Paris at night under the yellow lights still sparkles in millions of postcards, but right below those lights, there is a completely different France, where people without names, without codes, without addresses, are living quietly in the literal sense of the word, invisible. Number 2. The state, the law, and silent denial. In the modern social structure, the right to shelter is not just a need. It is the starting point for all other civil rights. France has policies that are considered progressive. In terms of law, the 2007 Delo law stipulates that everyone has the right to appeal if they are not provided with housing. The SRU law requires localities to ensure that at least 20–25% of new housing is social housing. But 17 years after Delo was introduced, less than 30% of complaints have been successfully resolved. Meanwhile, the localities with the best conditions are the slowest in allocating land to low-income people. Homelessness in France does not develop in a vacuum. It is a direct reflection of the performance of the legal system. There are policies but not enough fund standards, but not enough sanctions. More than 2 million applications for social housing are registered every year, but the number of new apartments only hovers around 80,000, a deficit of 1.92 million requests. This is not a normal gap, it is a structural gap. Paris authorities often cite the need to maintain order and the image of the city as a justification for the reorganization of public spaces ahead of major events. But the numbers tell a different story. In the first 6 months of 2023. Alone, nearly 2,000 homeless people in the inner city were evicted from temporary shelters without long-term alternatives. These interventions are administrative, without courts, without an appeals process. Enforcement may act in the same morning, but the consequences can last indefinitely. France has a detailed and rigorous legal system, once hailed as a European model of welfare. But when each individual in the system does his or her part without anyone taking responsibility for the overall outcome, what happens is the legal operation of a process of exclusion. Homelessness is not an accidental outcome, but the intended outcome of a series of technical conditions, procedurally valid, but lacking the capacity to regulate in practice. In many places, the requirement of a permanent address to be considered for assistance leaves hundreds of thousands of people excluded from the very first step. A zip code supposedly used only for mail has become the dividing line between those who are entitled to basic services and those who are excluded. Of the more than 4 million people living in precarious housing conditions, how many have been excluded simply because of a missing item on the application form, face-to-face? Number 3. When inequality becomes urban architecture. In big cities like Paris, Lyon, or Marseille, homelessness is not just a problem on the sidewalks. It is programmed into pricing structures, planning, and budget priorities. According to a report from INSEE, rents in the Île-de-France region alone increased by an average of 6.8% between 2021 and 2023. The cost of electricity, water heating, and other essential services also increased by almost 23% in just 1 year, pushing a large number of low-income people out of the city center. Living space is no longer allocated according to social needs, but according to the level of spending. The once stable middle class now has to compete with international real estate investors. Meanwhile, the social housing fund has not increased proportionally. Each year, France records nearly 2 million applications for HLM logement social, but only about 80,000 units are approved. Most newly built units do not meet the conditions to be called affordable. An obvious paradox in the same city of Paris, a 45 square meter apartment in the 16th arrondissement rents for nearly 2,000 euros a month, while an HLM apartment in the suburbs is only 500–600 euros. However, residents cannot choose the latter option because the waiting period can be from 3 to 8 years, depending on the area. In between are tens of thousands of people who are not eligible for open market rents, but also do not have access to subsidies. They are not eligible for emergency assistance, but their incomes are too low to sustain an independent life. A large portion of this group is at the threshold of losing their homes with just a small shock like job loss, breakup, or work-related injury. Housing inequality in France is no longer a consequence. It is an enduring structure of modern urbanism itself. And every 1% rise in house prices pushes tens of thousands of people closer to the point of no return. Number 4. The appearance of the city is prioritized over the right to exist. France is expected to welcome more than 100 million international visitors by 2023, with Paris remaining the most popular destination. However, the surge in visitors has coincided with a growing sense of uncertainty, the gap between expectations and reality. Many first-time visitors to the capital are left bewildered by rows of makeshift tents set up under bridges, groups of people lying on the steps of ancient buildings, or lines of people waiting to enter shelters in front of train stations. This is not an isolated phenomenon. In central arrondissements, such as the 10th, 18th, and Gare du Nord, the presence of homeless people has become part of the urban landscape. On some major metro lines, the number of people temporarily staying in the entrances or waiting areas exceeds the number of seats available for passengers. According to data from Paris Info, more than 62% of tourists have felt disappointed by seeing uncontrolled living areas at popular tourist attractions. A postcard can hide more than it shows. When a city's image is built through advertising, movies, and social media, the gap between what is imagined and what is real can easily backfire. Some tour operators have reported a decline in bookings for nighttime walking tours around the Saint-Denis area, which is near the Olympic Stadium, but also home to a large homeless population. Instead of a sense of discovery, many people feel anxious not because of specific dangers, but because of a general unease when faced with images they did not expect. There is a political dilemma. Can a city promote prosperity while ignoring visible signs of poverty? When the image of tourism directly conflicts with the image of real life, the choice between pretty and honest becomes more than a media decision. It is a test of a society's tolerance for inequality in the heart of the old city. Number 5. When charity organizations take on the state's work. In the French welfare system, the responsibility for providing temporary accommodation and emergency assistance rests with the state. However, over the years, delays in budget allocations, lack of human resources, and complex administrative processes have increasingly shifted this responsibility to non-state organizations. Charitable foundations, religious communities, and local spontaneous networks have become the front line dealing with situations that should have been addressed at the policy level. In fact, around 40% of people who receive cold weather shelter do so through networks coordinated by NGOs, not by public authorities. In cities like Marseille or Lyon, volunteer groups play a fundamental survival role, handing out hot meals, providing heating equipment, and organizing rotating sleeping arrangements in churches, cultural centers, or former schools. In the middle of a city with a GDP of 760 billion euros a year, thousands of people sleep under the canopy of an overpass. In one night, the tourism promotion budget can spend more than 200,000 euros on a media campaign, while the warming station in the 19th arrondissement has had to cut its distribution by half due to lack of funding. This turns a seemingly technical issue into a fundamental question of the allocation of responsibility. In a country with a dense welfare system, why have spontaneous groups become the main relief network? How much of the current assistance effort is the result of policy, and how much is the result of informal compensation? A system is only truly sustainable when its capacity to respond is its own, not supported by volunteerism. When kindness becomes the pillar rather than the catalyst, policy is no longer the solution, but merely the backdrop to a reality sustained by individual effort. And when there are no more people to do the work, the question becomes not who supports whom, but who is left to do it. Number 6. Being present is not the same as being seen. In large cities, homeless people are found on every street corner, but are often excluded from decisions that directly affect them. They are not consulted in housing planning. They are not represented in social support systems, and there are no official channels for reporting their living conditions. Their existence is obvious, but in the administrative system, they are almost excluded from the concept of residence. Data from a 2023 urban study found that nearly 75% of homeless people had no prior notice of being evicted from their temporary shelters. They received only a few hours' notice before the evacuation. With no alternative, many were forced to move farther into the suburbs, where there was no shelter, no running water, and often no volunteer support network. Meanwhile, the system of policy reflection relies on channels such as population surveys, city councils, or local assemblies, where people without addresses are often not eligible to participate. The important question here is, who has the right to be heard in public decisions? Their silence is not their choice, but the result of an administrative design that does not recognize the official existence of the homeless. Number 7 memories are outside the storage system. In official censuses, homeless people often appear only as total numbers. But behind each number are a series of stories that are not recorded in any administrative records. They do not leave addresses, do not have valid rental histories, and are often not counted in voter registrations. As a result, their experiences are rarely incorporated into urban histories or collective memories. A particularly serious consequence is the lack of data on the long-term consequences of living in unstable housing conditions. There are no specific statistics on rates of physical decline, on disruptions to children's education, or on the cumulative psychological effects of years of living on the margins. Health and education systems have no unique identifiers for people without addresses. When these experiences cannot be tracked or analyzed, they cannot inform policy. About 8 in 10 people without a permanent residence have spent some time in legal employment, meaning they were once a regular part of the economy. Loss of residence does not always come with a loss of capacity, but rather from a series of small disruptions in life. The only way to understand this mechanism is to approach their lived experience as a necessary part of the data, not as an afterthought. Data gaps not only hinder support, they also obscure policy accountability. When a fractured experience is not recorded, it appears as if it doesn't exist. And when it doesn't exist on record, there is no obligation to address it. That's how a society can turn a blind eye without breaking any laws. Number 8. The European social model starts to crack. On a continental level, France is not the only country facing rising homelessness. What makes France's case remarkable, however, is the extent to which its vaunted welfare model is at odds with the reality on the ground. As of 2024, France will have recorded an estimated 30.9 homeless people per 10,000 inhabitants, higher than the European Union average. That puts it behind only Germany, where the rate is above 48.7, but ahead of the UK, Spain, and the Netherlands. Comparing policies across countries reveals stark differences in approach. While Germany and France prioritize funding for short-term shelters, and traditional social housing countries like Finland take a completely different approach, providing permanent housing first, then implementing support services. Between 2008 and 2022, Finland reduced the number of homeless people to below 7,000, the lowest in the OECD, by implementing a comprehensive housing first model. In the Netherlands, local governments have direct authority to allocate emergency housing, cutting processing times to less than 30 days. In Portugal, many cities have integrated housing support with vocational training and public health programs, increasing long-term resilience. France has piloted such models, but they are still limited in scale and lack the budget to replicate them. There is no single model that fits all countries, but when countries of similar economic size achieve better results in less time, comparison becomes an objective measure. Effective policy is about more than spending. It is about how many people are lifted out of precarious situations in a sustainable way. Number 9. Experimentation is not enough to change the system. In France, the Housing First model has been piloted since the late 2010s. The core of this model is to provide permanent housing to homeless people before requiring any other conditions such as drug treatment or psychological treatment. Compared to the temporary support model, this approach has been shown to reduce long-term costs and increase reintegration efficiency. However, The number of apartments actually operating according to housing first principles in France accounts for only about 5% of all housing programs for homeless people. In Toulouse, a project to provide 400 apartments of this model in 2022 has recorded a 12-month occupancy rate of over 80%. However, the total number of eligible people in the locality exceeds 8,000. The gap between supply and demand creates a clear limit. The reform of policy philosophy has not been accompanied by sufficient resources for expansion. In addition to housing first, some cities have turned to hotels as emergency winter housing funded by the central government. This can be a quick response but is expensive and unsustainable. By the end of the cold season in 2023, more than 80% of the shelters rented out were forced to vacate within 2 weeks of the end of the temporary funding. With no transitional plan, many people are back in precarious housing situations. There is a less discussed point. Some social housing developments are moving towards public-private partnerships, but the norms still prioritize profit or affordability over urgent housing needs, causing the initial initiatives to drift away from the welfare goal. An initiative is only effective when it becomes a formal part of the system. When it remains a pilot project, its impact cannot reach the largest group. Those who are outside the administrative grid lack paperwork or do not have enough time to wait for the process. Real reform must start with changes in the way fixed budgets are allocated, not rely on ad hoc solutions applied seasonally. Number 10. City lights do not reach everything. Paris remains a global tourist icon, but alongside the bright lights of its plazas and grand facades is a network of informal spaces, sleepovers, that spring up and fall apart every day. The system is not short on regulation, but short on ongoing operation, leaving hundreds of thousands of people relying on makeshift solutions as their only available option. Data from 2024 shows that on average, there are more than 6,000 calls to the 115 emergency line each week for temporary shelter, but only about a third are answered. During the peak cold months, the rejection rate can reach 75%. These figures not only reflect demand that far exceeds capacity, but also the saturation of a system that is already stretched to its limits. Amid these statistics lies a blurring of the lines between stability and insecurity. In major urban areas, more than 30% of full-time workers still live in rental conditions that exceed the OECD's financial thresholds. Incomes may be sufficient to cover some services, but not enough to save or protect against any contingencies. The city continues to build, the budget is still allocated, and reports are still published. What remains constant, however, is the number of people kept at the door. They do not disappear, but gradually become part of the landscape that society has become accustomed to seeing. When an inequality becomes the new normal, the question is no longer when it will be solved, but whether it is even considered necessary to be solved at all. No one comes to Paris expecting unrest, but the juxtaposition of glamour and gritty reality makes this story impossible to ignore. This video is not meant to be conclusive, but to offer a different perspective on cities that seem so well understood. If you think this is a perspective worth spreading, please leave a comment below. We want to hear your opinion. No need to agree, just be honest. Don't forget to like. Share the video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to the NVL Travel Documentary channel to continue to accompany you on your journey of discovery, not just the places, but also the hidden meanings hidden beneath each city.